We don't usually think of war or military service as a family affair, but my research into my Leighton family has caused me to think that the folks back home are every bit as involved as those on the front, just in a different way. I will speak in this program of my father, Thomas Leighton, and his brother Linfield and their service during World War II, as well as that of their cousins, and also some of their predecessors who served during World War I. But at first, I would like to give you a bit of backstory about the Leighton family. The first Leighton in Nova Scotia came in 1775, having enlisted in the 84th Regiment of Foot in Boston, as I said, in 1775 to fight for the British. And the promise, of course, was that if he did, then his family would be cared for in Nova Scotia while he was in active service. And at the end of the conflict, there would be land grant opportunities for them as well. So this is how we arrived following the end of the war, during which period Joseph, the original, had disappeared, probably lost in active service somewhere where there's no record of that. But his young son Thomas enlisted in the year before the war was over, and he obviously was young enough that he was able to enlist as a drummer. And when the war was over, the family settled pretty much in the Wentworth area, Wentworth Creek, just outside Windsor. This is where the story begins, really, for the Leighton family. Here you see my grandfather, George Leighton, with his two young sons, Lindy on the left, 2 years younger than Thomas. And essentially the family were farmers. They lived very handy, the gypsum works in Wentworth Creek, so my grandfather was involved in that as well, as was his father before him. Here we see uh, Thomas on the right, his brother Lindy in the center, with their older sister Alice. This photo was probably about 1923 or so. Their younger sister, Faye, had died at about 10 months of age with pneumonia, leaving just the three children. This is my father, Thomas, in his uniform. He enlisted in 1941. His basic training took place in Debert, Sussex in New Brunswick, and Petawawa in Ontario before he shipped out to England. During the period of time that he was engaged in war with the 87th Canadian Field Battery of the Royal Canadian Artillery, he wrote letters, probably irregularly, to his mother. I have copies of those. Actually, I have the original letters. And for the most part, the tone in them is upbeat. Clearly, he was not anxious to alarm his mother, for which I'm sure she was very grateful. In some occasions, he was actually fairly humorous, and he talked about life in the various places that he visited. He talked about doing the kinds of drill duty that they had to do and so on, living in barracks camps and so on. And after they were shipped off to England, of course, he talks quite a bit about the various maneuvers that they went on before they actually engaged the enemy after Normandy. Because he was in the artillery, of course, he did not leave England at the same time the infantry did. So all the stories, the horror stories that we see and hear about crossing the channel to the shores of France that the infantry experienced were not his experience. The artillery, and of course we're talking about the big trucks and the big cannon, they went as much as several weeks later. But he must have been a relatively good boy during his service. The medals suggest that he behaved himself reasonably well. I think likely my grandparents were fairly proud of him. And of course, after the war, he received support from the Veterans Land Act and bought the farm in 9 Mile River in East Hants, where he lived for the rest of his life and where I grew up. And our grandparents, his parents, lived with us during that period of time up until their respective deaths. The only memorial only real memorial I ever saw of his military service included the jacket that you see him wearing in this picture, which he wore until it was no longer wearable, and that red pennant, the 87th Canadian Field Battery RCA pennant, that hung on the wall of our dining room pretty well most of the years I was growing up. But the medals, the attestation booklet, his service beret, none of those things were obvious during my childhood. This is a picture of the unit that he belonged to. And I've never had any problem picking him out in this lineup. If you look at the mouth of the cannon, he's the second to the left with his head tilted slightly to the right. That would be my father with his head in that position. His role in the service was as a truck driver. And one of these monstrous troop trucks was his job to shepherd through mud in pitch black occasions as they went out on maneuvers in England, because of course you couldn't show light because there were Luftwaffe planes overhead looking for good bombing targets, and a moving convoy of trucks would be an ideal target. I remember once he told me that to be a truck driver in this service, you had to be able to stop a truck without using the brakes. And that would be a bit of a challenge, I'm sure, in some cases, although depending on how deep the mud was. But I think some of my father's backstory probably would serve him in good stead, because I can remember him telling little stories occasionally about careening down the hill there in Wentworth in a car or a jalopy or an old truck or whatever without any brakes, and that was kind of the experiment for him. That was the training ground that got him into the truck driving business. He was probably a very good truck driver, and I'll read you a couple of excerpts that suggest that. This letter is dated March of 1945, and partway through he makes a comment regarding the notion that people were beginning to get that the war was almost over. And he says, by the way, don't get any ideas about this war ending too soon. That is the trouble with people at home. They all want to believe it will be over soon, so then they believe it. When it does end, I or a lot of us won't believe it for a week or so. Jerry has plenty of punch yet. That is, too much to be real comfortable. But I hope it soon ends. I wish I could be home at the 1st of July, but I don't expect to. When I do get home, I think I will build a shack, stick the stovepipe out the window, build a stove out of a tin barrel, and dig a slit trench in the middle of it. And I think I will give up truck driving. It's a pretty good occupation at times, but at other times not so good. An officer from the infantry told me one time I would make a good bus driver. That was one night I took a bunch of guys up. Their truck had broken down. He told me after that, after I had nearly run into a cement roadblock, a bomb crater, and a couple of trucks, and nearly stood the truck on her nose from stopping too quick. I think he was sarcastic. Dad had a sense of humor, as you can tell, and but at the same time, um, it's interesting to think about him on the other side of the water and wondering what was going on over here with the folks at home, and simply trying to, stay alive. Some of the letters are a little bit more descriptive than others, but not a lot of them. Again, as I said, I think of my poor grandmother on this side, worrying every time a communication came, and especially if it was a telegram communication. And one of the items in this box of letters is a telegram that Dad sent. And so I'm sure when it was delivered, and it's an official looking telegram, and my grandmother would probably think, oh my heavens, oh my goodness, what now? And her heart in her throat until she opens it up and she reads, "Send me $25." Because, of course, all the money went to her and she passed it back to him when he needed it. Some years ago, my father had some little accident that resulted in a broken bone, and he was laid up for a few weeks. And of course, he was the kind of person that always wanted to be doing something, had to be busy. And I could see his possibility of driving my mother completely nuts as he recuperated from this accident and not able to get out and do the things that he wanted to do. So I bought him a notebook and I said, here, write your memoirs. You've had a big, long, busy life. Now tell us about it. I thought it was instructive that he started after the war with his memoir. And I want to read you the first paragraph. I have to point out, too, that as soon as he was able to get back on his feet, that's when the memoir writing stopped. So he writes, well, as the saying goes, here goes nothing. Here I am, home, after 4 years in the Army, 3 of them in England and Europe. Nearly 1 in action, a little money, not much, some gratuity, a sort of credit from the government for being in the Army. Stupid, footloose, restless, didn't want to stay home, didn't want to go away, didn't want to take a course, of which there were many, just sort of stunned. When the ship sighted Nova Scotia, I would have been just as happy if it had turned around and went back to England. My life seemed to be over there instead of here. And that was the story of Tom Leighton's war service. Now, his brother Linfield, whom we all called Lindy, was a little bit different kettle of fish. If you had to compare the two men, I'd have to say that Lindy was far more, adventurous might be the best word for it. He certainly was anxious to get into the service because he enlisted before Dad did, and he was 2 years younger than Dad. And as you see here in this picture, he looks a mere boy. So regarding his adventurous nature, I recently had a story from a friend who was talking to somebody from down that Wentworth Creek area who, when he found out that my friend knew the Leighton family, asked if he was any connection to the Leightons in Wentworth Creek. And of course, my friend said, oh, yes. And so he recounted a story from way back. And I think it would have to have been, oh, if not the late 20s, then certainly sometime in the early 30s, because Lindy was born in 1921. And this gentleman was driving in the Wentworth Road towards Windsor with his window down, and all of a sudden he could hear shouting. And one voice was, "Cut her down." The other voice was, "Get down out of there. Cut her down. Get down out of there." And this on back and forth. And when he got close enough to see what was taking place, what was happening was that my uncle Lindy was up in an apple tree, an old tree that my grandfather wanted to cut down. And Lindy wanted to ride the tree to the ground. I think that probably sums up some of the rationale for his military career as well, which you'll see in just a moment. He initially enlisted with the Halifax Rifles, and his tenure there did not last long at all. The reason being that one night when he was out on guard duty and came back to the barracks, he discovered one of his barracks mates urinating in a bag of dulse that my grandmother had sent him. And of course, Lindy's temper, being such as it was, kind of acted against the gentleman. And the end result, of course, was that he was honorably discharged. But when you think about what the man did, I mean, obviously he probably thought it was a prank, and obviously did not know Lindy very well. But there are two things. Like my grandmother grew up on in Cambridge on the Minas Basin shore, and one of the big fall time activities was going out on the mudflats at low tide and picking dulse. And enough dulse that, seaweed, for those of you who don't know the term, dulse, that would keep the family in this treat for the whole winter. And here was Lindy's dulse essentially totally violated. And I think in some respects, his mother, that would be Lindy's point of view, insulted because of all the effort that she had put into gathering it in the first place and then sending it to him. So, as I said, he was discharged from the service and then moved on to his next segment of his military career. Here we see him a little bit older in his Royal Canadian Air Force uniform. In a letter, I should say here that Lindy passed away younger, quite a bit younger than my dad did, in early 2000s. And following his death, his younger son, Eric, my cousin, undertook to ferret out the story of his father's military service. Neither Dad nor Uncle Lindy had a lot to say about the war. They talked about the funny stuff, the peculiar things, but never any of the horrible stuff, which I'll talk about shortly. And so Eric was really interested in knowing just exactly what kind of service his father had. So and as a result of all his research, which was extensive, both here in Canada and in England, and as a result of tracking down one of the last living member of the bomber team that Lindy belonged to find out more about the man who was his father. And in the book, Eric writes that in a letter to my grandmother, Uncle Lindy notes that he didn't make the cut for pilot, and he didn't want to be a bomber. That particular role that some of the gunners had, because the notion that he would be dropping live bombs on innocent civilians just really did not appeal to him. So he, for the duration of his military career, in that bomber team, was a rear gunner. And the rear gunner sat up in a little turret, uh, exposed, as it were, because he had to see what was going on outside. And his role was to shoot at enemy airplanes that were trying to bring his plane down. And that's what it was to be a rear gunner. And that was the kind of career that my uncle had in the military. He flew 40 missions. And I remember reading a comment that the man that Eric found to talk about this with said that there were a number of those airplanes when they returned to England that never flew again. They were that badly damaged. But 40 missions is pretty phenomenal. When you consider the vulnerability of the position that Uncle Lindy would have had within the plane itself. He had a reputation of being lucky. And in fact, Eric's book is entitled Lucky Leighton, Armed and Charmed. And I can remember my father telling me a long time ago that Lindy was lucky. And he said, Dad said that he could stand out on the side of the road all day with his thumb in the air trying to hitch a ride. All Lindy had to do was go out and stick his thumb in the air, and the first car that went by him stopped and picked him up. That was their perception of Lindy as a lucky person. This telegram was received by my grandmother in Wentworth Creek from Lindy when he arrived in England, February 7, 1944, and all well and safe, all my love. This image is of the Halifax bomber that obviously one of several that they flew, and Lindy is the last person on the right. My family is relatively long-lived. Here in the front you can see what was the young man in the first slide I showed you, George, my grandfather, in his 90s. He was 96 when he passed away, and Dad and Uncle Lindy standing behind him. I didn't realize until I started digging just how extensively the Leighton family and cousins from other, the so-called distaff sides of the family, how they were involved, how much they were involved in the war. This gentleman is Roy Leighton, who would have been a second cousin to my father and Uncle Lindy. And I never heard Dad speak of either him or Murray Leighton. Dad talked about some of the guys from back home, as it were, because as I said, we grew up in 9 Mile River, and we had some contact with some of the family from down there, but, second cousins don't get together frequently. And Dad never mentioned, as far as I ever knew, this Roy Leighton. Roy Leighton, or this gentleman, Ron Leighton, was frequently mentioned, enough that I recognized the name. And of course, he too is a second cousin to my father, who served overseas. And he was a brother to Roy. And they were both sons of Stephen and Grace Leighton. And he survived the war. Here you see him with his son, Mike, and Mike is served as a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Here he is in his dress uniform with his father, displaying all his medals and memorabilia from the war. But this is the memorial for Roy William Leighton, um, remembered with honor, and he's buried in the Adigum Canadian War Cemetery, uh, which is beautifully pictured here. And their cousin Murray Leighton, likewise, never returned. And again, I never knew anything about Murray Leighton until I started delving into the family genealogy. Um, he was a son of Harry Leighton, who, interestingly enough, was a private in the Army during World War One, and he was a son of William and Cassie Leighton. And actually here, I might as well say, there were two that I could find from the Leighton family in Wentworth area who served during World War One. And Harry Leighton was one. And again, it would be a cousin, the son of James and Hattie Leighton. Thomas, his name was Thomas William Leighton, who was a war casualty. He did not come home. He was killed in action. He was a member of the 85th Brigade, would be the Expeditionary Force, and did not return. And that's the big tragedy of war, is the family that does not come back, and the family back home who have to live with that. Avard Wilcox was also a cousin, first cousin of Dad's, through his mother, my grandmother. Avard's mother was Ethel Lance, married to Emery Wilcox in Pembroke in Hants County. And he, and I'm pretty sure his brother Gerald, both served overseas. And Avard and Dad were fairly close. After the war, Avard brought back a young British woman as a war bride, and they actually boarded at my grandparents in Wentworth Creek for some time, well, certainly up until my grandparents moved to 9 Mile River along with Dad. But there were other cousins as well that I want to mention. And again, they're from the Lance family, and they were a family that Dad would have had a fair amount of contact with growing up. His uncle, my grandmother's brother, Guilford Lance, and his family were in Falmouth, not too far away from Wentworth Creek, and 3 of their sons went overseas. Orland Lance, Carlton Lance, and Raymond Lance. And there's a bit of a tradition here too when you look at families who were involved in war. So we saw 2 Leightons who were involved in World War One, and then all of these cousins and brothers who were involved in World War Two. Raymond's son Brian, who is retired from the Canadian Armed Forces and lives now in Australia, also made a career with the military and did military service as part of the Canadian Peacekeeping Force in the NATO thing in Europe, in Germany, during the 1960s. So there's that service that you expect that happens with a family where military service has been known to happen. Didn't happen in my family. None of my brothers joined the military, and also Raymond, Brian's father, brought a young woman back from England as a war bride as well. So these are all the ones that I know about at this point. But I, just want to say a word before we leave the Leightons about how important it is to remember that families are engaged in in wartime in so many ways, even if they never ever leave the shores of Nova Scotia. And you look at the care packages. Dad writes of them in his letters about the anticipation of a Christmas package, for example, or receiving a package of knit goods, mittens, and socks and whatnot that he shared among his teammates. And this is what's important. In wartime is knowing that the mothers and fathers who are left home are suffering in a different way, worrying about whether their sons are going to return or not. And it's one of the hazards of war. I consider myself to be extraordinarily lucky that none of my two sons ever was faced with a situation where they had to go to war. Thank you very much.